Okay. All right. I've got sound, it looks like. And I'm back. It's been a little while. So, yeah, I feel like there hasn't been a whole hell of a lot to talk about. We're kind of in the waiting room, just waiting for things to develop, and there's just been the usual fucking drama. Um, you know, Trump showed his true colors. Like, what the fuck did people think was going to happen there? The whole Iran thing, it's just a continuation of what's been going on. And the whole Iran thing is keeping people's investments from falling apart and crashing. So, it's just more of the same shit. But I wanted to get on today. First off, it's Lughnasadh. So Lughnasadh is the Gaelic harvest festival. It's the feast, the holy day of the sun god Lu. So Lu is a god of light, of intellectual and spiritual light, of the sunlight, of artistry and craftsmanship. And his name comes from the root word where we get the names Luke and Lucifer, Loki, all that kind of stuff. In the Germanic world, this holiday would be Freifaxi. Freifaxi, or what's the other one? I made a note. Leifblot. So, in either culture, whether you're talking about Gaelic or Germanic, this is the festival that begins the harvest. You can also call it first harvest. August 1st is the midpoint between Midsummer's Day, middle summer on June 21st, and then the fall equinox, the vernal equinox. Excuse me, not the vernal, the autumnal equinox on September the 21st. So it's these in-between periods between solstices and equinoxes where we start the seasons. So this is actually the first day of fall in the northern hemisphere. That was the reckoning for thousands of years until the college girls and college boys of the science establishment decided to make the first days of the seasons on the solstices and equinoxes. But definitely not it. So anyway, this is first harvest. This is the feast of the light of the sun god. So in Gaelic culture, we've got Lu, and then in the Germanic, the his Norse name is Frey, and continental German, it's Fro, so Fro. So different pronunciations, same name. So it's one of the feasts of the sun god. We celebrate how this light of the sun god has helped our crops to grow so that we have a harvest. So it's a big celebration day. This is when the agricultural year starts winding down. People get a chance to rest, even though we don't live like that anymore. So that's the way it was. So big day here. Big festival for the sun god. Now, 3 days ago, Tony Fauci, Dr. Tony the Rat Fauci, Mr. Needlecraft, Clot Shot, Cooties Epidemic. He was subpoenaed before Congress, and he's getting grilled in there, and it's like probably nothing will come of that because the courts are corrupt and just the people are corrupt. Because that whole establishment and industry he's part of, this pharmaceutical industrial complex, it creates fabulous, vain, silly, fucking lifestyles for people. Middle class lifestyles. I'm not saying, the whole middle class is a bunch of assholes, but there are a lot of assholes in that demographic. And they cover up for each other's bullshit and each other's misdeeds. And they hide things for each other, so they don't like to admit that somebody with a beautiful house and a fabulous lifestyle can do just horrible things to make a buck. But anyway, Fauci was in those Senate hearings. He was getting grilled by Rand Paul. Rand Paul's a decisive figure. What politics does to people is it convinces people that one in two people on this planet are evil because they don't agree with them. It's extremely childish. It's the stuff of schoolyard, from when people are children. So, yeah, I mean, he's a fucker in his own right. I don't trust him because I've never met him. So I don't think he's a great guy, but these hearings are going on. There's effort to bring Tony the Rat to light. And the key factor in this whole thing is that when he was being questioned by the Senate, he invoked his Fifth Amendment rights. So if you're not from the United States, if you're not American, or you are American, you just don't know what the Fifth Amendment is. The Fifth Amendment is an amendment to the Constitution, to the U.S. Constitution, that protects us from self-incrimination. So if you are party to some legal proceeding and you are asked to give information that could incriminate you, which would precipitate ultimately in your imprisonment, you are protected from giving up that information. So Dr. Fauci pleaded the Fifth and didn't want to answer the questions. So the Fifth Amendment is not something that's invoked because you're annoyed and you don't feel like answering someone's questions. The Fifth Amendment is invoked to cover your ass and keep you out of prison. So that's a very important distinction here. So in invoking his Fifth Amendment rights, Fauci admitted that he's guilty of something. I don't know specifically what that is, but he's admitted it. So this is a vindication. It's encouragement for people who held out against the clot shots, against the needlecraft, who knew it was a bad idea to be experimented on by the pharmaceutical industrial complex. So it's big news. I don't think Tony the Rat Fauci is going to be convicted, but it's like we said, and this has progressed. On one hand, it has progressed faster than I imagined, but on the other hand, I thought this whole thing was going to fall apart. I think a lot of things will fall apart. I think in the early 2030s, the world we're living in is going to collapse like the Soviet Union. Nobody, except for the Nazis who were feeding the US all of its intelligence on the Soviet Union, nobody except the Nazis back in the early 90s knew that the Soviet Union was going to fall. And they kept it from Central Intelligence. So a little tangent there. All of the US government's and US intelligence services and US military's intelligence on the Soviet Union during the Cold War came through Nazi agents. These agents were part of a network that was set up at the beginning of World War II by German army intelligence and by SS intelligence. And the head of the German military intelligence after World War II became head of the intelligence service of West Germany, and he kept his spy networks in Ukraine intact. So a lot of people in Europe, a lot of countries in Europe don't particularly like Ukraine. They don't particularly trust a lot of Ukrainians because, and a lot of great people in Ukraine, don't get me wrong, but there's a distrust there because the Ukrainians were really the big Nazi collaborators as a group, not as a whole, but as a group. If you wanted to single a country out, Ukraine was a big one. Croatia, there was a lot of collaboration, but Ukraine was a much bigger country. And it was much more instrumental in the post-World War II Nazi agenda. So the Nazis didn't go away because they never surrendered to the Allies. If you go to the document that ended World War II, the Nazi Party and the SS never signed it. And they're in law, in the legal world, there is no you know what I mean. You know what I meant to say. If it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. So, yeah. Anyway, this whole world we're living in right now, I'm pretty goddamn sure in the early 2030s is going to come down like the Soviet Union very suddenly because mass media is just telling us it's going to be great. And if your party wins the next election, they're going to start fixing it and they're going to save you, which is utter bullshit. Nobody's coming to save anyone. You either save yourself, you either cooperate with other people who want to save themselves, or you're not saved at all. Nobody's going to do it for you. It's completely fucking lazy. This whole idea of somebody coming to save us, whether there's some spiritual being or one that lives on earth, that is fucking Middle Eastern. That is Semitic, okay? So the Semitic world has its origins in Sumer and Babylon. The Bible, the Old Testament, it's completely plagiarized out of the Babylonian mythological epics and the duality of God versus Satan. That comes from Zoroastrianism out of Iran, aka Persia. And Iran was founded by Indo-Europeans, so people like my ancestors. But they ended up living in the desert and they went fucking crazy because living in the desert makes people crazy. And it makes them obsessed with purity and perfection, which are illusions. So, yeah. Those religions from the Middle East, they're codependent. They teach people to get their self-worth from sucking up to some messiah. And messiahs are the biggest egomaniacs because they go and they save people because they can't deal with their own personal problems. And it's like I always say, Jesus is basically a prototypical rich boy. And he does things he doesn't want to do because he's afraid he's not going to get his inheritance. He didn't want to get crucified. So, whereas a figure like Odin hanged himself on a tree because he wanted to gain wisdom and knowledge and self-mastery. That's a whole subject too. The cross was considered too pagan for Christianity until 1,000 years ago when they decided they want to start conquering the Germanic lands. So then they plagiarized Odin hanging on a tree. So anyway, being saved, that is a Middle Eastern Semitic concept. So I'm not anti-Semitic. All people have their right to live well. But that Semitic worldview, that Semitic spirit is incapable with all other peoples in the world. But Christianity and Islam are the two prevailing religious corporations. They're religious multinational corporations. And they reach the top of the market by killing people and by gaslighting people. So, really, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, they're a trinity. Islam and Christianity are basically the two legs that Judaism walks around on. And Judaism is the skeleton key. It's the psychological skeleton key to the minds of Muslims and Christians. Because Muslims and Christians are practicing an export version of Judaism. And another thing about Babylon, Sumer, the Middle East, all that stuff, that's where racial supremacy comes from. So Judaism invented racism and racial supremacy as we know it. Because when you look at the book of Genesis, Abraham is from Jehovah's favorite bloodline, and he tells him that his descendants are going to rule the world someday because they're racially superior. And even in the New Testament, it is continually established and reestablished that Jesus comes from the bloodline of King David. So they are constantly reestablishing Jesus' racial purity and racial superiority. So those religions are not compatible with people from outside the desert. And the whole thing in the Bible with, the promised land, that was the Fertile Crescent. It's the land surrounding the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers that go through northern Turkey and Iraq, right next to Iran. And then you've got the Mediterranean coast right nearby where, present day Israel and Lebanon are. So those people just sat on their asses in the land of plenty and waited to be saved by messiahs. Whereas my ancestors, the Indo-Europeans, they started in the steppes and the plains of Russia and Ukraine. And they went westward and northward, and they created homelands in harsh wildernesses. You look at countries like Ireland, Scotland, England, Scandinavia, even parts of France and Germany, there's not a lot of food there. You have to terraform the land to set up agriculture. So they had a pioneering spirit, and they went out there and they created homelands, whereas the Semites sat on their asses and they stole goats and camels and sheep from each other, which they were doing up until about the early 1920s when oil was found in Arabia. So they were shit poor and had nothing before oil was found. And if people stopped buying that oil, they'd be shit poor again because they don't have their own car manufacturers. They don't make airplanes. They don't make anything for themselves. So that's that whole Semitic spirit is you bow down to abusive gods like Jehovah, which are basically demons. I think even Jesus is some form of a demon, really. People should have their right to be Christians or Jews or Muslims or whatever. I will support their right to do that, but I'm not joining those bandwagons because they're abusive, and they get their adherents to prove their loyalty, like Jehovah did to Abraham, where he said, "You're going to take your son up on the mountain and sacrifice him to me." And right at the instant when Abraham was about to sacrifice his son Isaac, Jehovah called the whole thing off, and he said, "Oh, I was just testing your loyalty, just to see how loyal you are to me." So that's very unhealthy. So if you've grown up in one of these three religions, you've been psychologically abused your whole life, and you're actually fucking scarred from it, and you have low self-esteem from it. So I'm not knocking people. I'm not saying anyone's stupid or they're an asshole or anything like that, but I'm just saying they create a lot of baggage. So in my opinion, this whole thing with Fauci admitting he's guilty of something by invoking his Fifth Amendment rights to non-incrimination. It's interesting. It happened right before Lughnasadh, right before Freifaxi, right before this harvest feast where we give thanks to our sun gods for helping our crops to grow and our harvest to come in. This was especially for those of us who, maintained our genetic integrity by not getting this experimental gene therapy of the early 2020s. Even if we don't know much about our ancestral gods and ancestral spirits, we were guided by them. And we were in touch enough with our ancestors to receive their protection. Because your DNA, that's your ancestral soup. That DNA doesn't only code for your physical makeup, but it's an archive of your ancestors, of their traits and what they experienced and their ordeals and their victories. So to me, those shots were basically selling out our ancestors because they went and corrupted DNA. They weren't the V word, they were a gene therapy. And that's become hating ourselves and hating our ancestors has become increasingly popular since the 1920s. After the 1920s, you had the modernist movement where a bunch of upper middle class people, primarily Ivy Leaguers, they started embracing sort of the trope of the noble savage. So they're basically saying, "Oh, all these people with other color skin, they're so much better than us. We white people are such pieces of shit. We're so lame." And this is because people with money don't deal with their personal problems. That's why the American dream was. That's one of the appealing things about the American dream was, especially after World War II, you had this middle class that was way too big. Only a financial Ponzi scheme could support it. And one of the appealing things about becoming middle class is you can hide behind university degrees, beautiful houses, retirement accounts. You can hide behind these things and not deal with your personal problems. So these neurotic upper middle class, Ivy League types started this whole modernist movement about how terrible we were and started teaching people with light skin tones, Europeans, Americans, so on and so forth, to hate themselves, which does nothing. It actually breaks your self-esteem down and it helps people manipulate you. And, that whole term white really pisses me off because white was a term cooked up by WASPs. So WASP is an acronym, stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So it's an ethnic group, but it really refers to people who are, middle class and upper class. So they created this whole term white. These people, so this is before the 1960s. Before the 1960s, these people, we used to tell European immigrants in America, like Italians, Greeks, Eastern Europeans, Poles, French Canadians, Irish, whoever, they used to say, well, you people are not white like us. So they were the gatekeepers for whiteness. So whiteness basically meant living up to upper middle class university educated standards. So it was extremely exclusive. And even in their own ethnic group, who we call Yankees, the Anglos from up north whose families came in colonial times, the working class ones weren't even considered white before the 1960s. So then in the 1960s, when, the upper middle class, especially the Ivy Leaguers, really started hating themselves, it was when the civil rights movement was catching on. So a lot of middle class people wake up in the middle of the night with a cold sweat and they're panicking that they're not popular enough and that people don't like them. So as segregation was falling and equality was rising and the civil rights movement reached its peak when the Civil Rights Act was signed, these upper middle class Ivy League types wanted to be popular. So what they did was they flipped this term white around and they went to the European ethnic groups here in America who they previously told were not white. Pretty much overnight, they went to them and said, you're evil white people just like us. And, these communities were like, you told us we weren't white, even though we have the same skin tone or we're possibly even lighter than you. like in the case of the Irish, and a lot of people in French Canada and Poland and places like that. And they were like, no, 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 you've always been white. You didn't know that? So it's total gaslighting. So a lot of people with money, I'm losing my train of thought. A lot of people with money are mentally ill and they don't want to deal with their own fucking personal problems. So, and that stems from this Middle Eastern Messiah mindset, where either you're the Messiah who's going to save someone, and a lot of people do play Messiah every day, or you're going to get saved. So, yeah, nobody's coming to save us. So, yeah, Tony the Rat's going down, along with these Middle Eastern religions. So this is a good augury, a good little omen that he was dragged into the Senate right before Lughnasadh, this harvest festival, this celebration of the sun god, and he pleaded the fifth because there's plenty he can incriminate himself about and get himself convicted if any courts actually had the will to prosecute him. So I don't know, it could happen, but I'm not going to hold my breath about it. So you guys have had a break from my rambling, but all of these topics are connected. And the more we build what's the word I'm looking for? The more we build our attention spans, the more you can see the connections. Because right now, a lot of people only have the attention span for 10-second sound bites like, media spits out. So, yeah. So Tony the Rat, Fauci's going down. He was never going to save anyone. He's not going to save you or anyone else ever. So that's that. More will follow. Talk to you guys later.